The hills were alive in Salzburg, not with the sound of music, not, contrary to my good friend Peter Oborne's prediction here just last Friday, that Mrs. Merkel and Mrs. May would kiss and the deal would be done. In fact, the sound with which the hills of Salzburg were alive was the bark of a firing squad. The picture I saw, I will never forget it, had the members of the EU leadership sitting in a circular table with a spotlight coming from above. They looked to me like the board of directors of Smersh, the evil organisation in the James Bond films. And that, dear listener, is what I consider them to be. I believe that Theresa May has been negotiating with the unnegotiable. She has been seeking to reason with the unreasonable. Because the essential point is this: the European Union cannot afford to allow any country to go free from its grip, because many countries in the European Union, if it could be demonstrated that that was possible, would themselves be for the off. That's why the European leaders have clung absolutely like a limpet to what they call the four freedoms. The four freedoms to exploit, the four freedoms to create a European space which enshrines neoliberal economics, austerity politics, and the supremacy of the European Central Bank. They can't allow an end to freedom of movement, as it's called. But what is really at risk is the right of any sovereign country in the European Union to decide who, out of hundreds of millions of EU citizens, can come and live and work in their country. Thus, the EU is the negation of national sovereignty. Now, I was a disciple of the Right Honourable Tony Benn. He argued for all of the decades that I was at his side that we needed to leave the European Union if we wanted to recover our democracy, our right as a sovereign people to forge our own path, to govern ourselves and our economy as we democratically decided to do. And that is literally impossible. I don't mean difficult, I don't mean tricky, I mean impossible. It is impossible for a Jeremy Corbyn, John MacDonald government to pursue the fiscal and economic policies which they have adjudged to be vital for British people's futures. They may not do so if we remain within the European Union. So, I knew that the hills would not be alive with the sound of music. I knew that my good friend Peter Oborne was talking through his hat last Friday. And we'll play you some of the actuality to let you hear my scepticism. So I was not remotely surprised when the EU leadership treated the British Prime Minister not with disrespect, but with contempt. A 10-minute slot. 10 minutes! I can hardly get my name and address out in 10 minutes. She was supposed to deliver in 10 minutes the case for her Chequers proposals, which she has not been able to convince even the Conservative Party of. Not even her own government. She lost two of her biggest beasts from the cabinet over Chequers. So the Tories don't want Chequers. The EU didn't want it either. And here's the rub, dear listener. We are now in a situation where nothing can pass the House of Commons. A no-deal Brexit will be voted down by the entirety, virtually, of the Labour opposition and scores, if not hundreds, of Conservatives and others. So a no-deal Brexit cannot pass the House of Commons. Now, I know that it's the default position, and it would not be a substantive motion, but you can still negate a default position by a negative vote in the House of Commons. I'll explain that later if people want to know the niceties. In any case, if the government lost its default position vote, there would immediately have to be a motion of no confidence in the government, and the government would lose it. So we are now in general election territory. We haven't crossed that threshold yet, so I'm free to speak my mind, and here is my mind. Theresa May cannot govern this country. This country is adrift. It is adrift on an ocean of incompetence, inequality, which is now worse than it was in 1914. Just think about that. Incompetence, which has left us entirely bereft of any national leadership at all. This Prime Minister cannot provide it. The alternative, conservative Prime Ministers of Boris Johnson and what's his name? Jeremy Hunt. Hunt, I tell you. Are you serious? Jeremy Hunt as Winston Churchill at a time of national peril? Please. Boris Johnson, he may be the one that they plump for. But even he will have to face a general election, because we will be in, to continue the nautical metaphor, entirely uncharted waters. We would have crashed out by default of the EU without a deal. And inevitably, all the consequences of that would follow. You could go on in a desultory way, dealing with this issue or that issue when it arose. But it would be 1940. It would be ourselves alone. It would be the enemy at the Channel ports, blocking your imports, stopping your exports. It would be chaos. And Boris Johnson doesn't do chaos all that well, in my opinion. So a general election is ineluctable, inescapable, and I believe the case for it is unanswerable. Moreover, I've been saying that for quite some time, because if you go back through the back shows of the mother of all talk shows, you'll realise that I have been saying this, not for months, but for 2 years. We should have left on day one, when Jeremy Corbyn proposed that we press the button of Article 50 on day one, the day after the referendum. That's when we should have done it. We should have sent, proverbially, an email saying, we're leaving, our people have decided, we're off, we mean you no harm, and we presume you mean us no harm. We will place no tariffs or barriers on your goods and services, and we presume you will place none on ours. We will continue to cooperate with you on security, terrorism, police matters, and we will implement standards of food, of hygiene, of the environment that will be no less than yours. And if we have the right government, will be even better than yours. And at that point, we should have been going around the country and going around the world, rallying our people for our new future, leaving the EU and joining the world. That's what we should have done. So, as I often say, being half an Irishman, I'm entitled to say, as the man did, no doubt apocryphally, when asked, the road to Dublin, oh, I wouldn't have started from here. But now we are here. What's going to be done? Theresa May says she will not break up her country, although Britain had no compunction about breaking up Ireland's country. This partition of just 6 counties of somebody else's country has to end. And now is the time to end it. Are we really saying we're going to crash out without a deal to please 350,000 voters of the Democratic Unionist Party? To please Ian Paisley Jr. if he's back from Colombo? The only sane border between Britain and the EU runs down the middle of the Irish Sea. The majority of people in the 6 counties voted to remain in the EU. The majority of people in the Irish Republic are mad for the EU. You don't have to be Einstein to work out what should happen next. That majority in the north, in the 6 counties, should join their compatriots in a united Ireland. Problem solved. And all the other problems can be resolved by a British government with a majority. I hope, as will come as no surprise, that that would be a Labour government. But any government with a majority which doesn't cling to the fringes of the orange sashes of the DUP will be able to resolve customs and trading arrangements. England's difficulty is historically Ireland's opportunity, and now is the time to prove it. Now, he's controversial, like me, but everybody reads him, just as everybody listens to me. He's my old pal Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday. Dan, welcome.
Good evening.
Now, you, I see, think that Theresa May had her Churchill moment in Downing Street today. Tell us why.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously she got ambushed out in Salzburg yesterday. The European Union basically, tossed casually and quite callously tossed aside her Brexit plan. I think there was a suspicion that if they did that, she would then have to come back cap in hand with a new offer to them. And she did the opposite. She basically stood up in Downing Street. She said, "This is the offer I've given you. I've made concessions to get to this point. You need to start giving concessions to me. And if you don't, then unfortunately, we're going to have to leave without a deal." And
doesn't the word ambush imply a surprise of some kind? Contrary, I had our friend Peter Oborn on here last Friday. We did try to get you, but we couldn't reach you. And Peter said the hills were going to be alive with the sound of music in Salzburg, that the EU were going to be kissing, air kissing probably, with Theresa May. But I said last Friday that they're going to not be alive with the sound of music, but the sound of a firing squad. I was certain they were going to do what they did. Are you really saying it was a surprise?
Yeah, I think it was certainly a surprise at this stage of the negotiations. I mean, if you remember, Theresa May, as we have seen, has taken a significant political risk. She moved her position towards that of the European Union. She lost David Davis as a result of that. She lost Boris Johnson as a result of that. We've seen her premiership brought to the brink by the reaction amongst her MPs within the party, her members. There was a backlash amongst the public, certainly initially, although that position has stabilised as people have got a bit bored of Brexit again. But she took a big political risk to bring her position closer to something that the EU would regard as acceptable. And we haven't really had a similar response from the EU or any sort of indication from the EU that they are prepared to give concessions to her. Now, I actually thought at this stage of the process we would see some movement, and certainly the briefing that we all had within the press call was that actually this would be a relatively low-key meeting, a relatively low-key event with some movement, some diplomatic language, but no one was expecting such a sort of a graphic and sort of overt repudiation of May's plan. And certainly we didn't expect Donald Tusk to be roaming around on Twitter posting, Twitter memes, taking the mick out and openly mocking Theresa May. So no, I mean, I think the EU's response did come as a surprise, certainly to me.
Well, wasn't there a clue in the fact they only gave her 10 minutes? I mean, the length of our interview this evening, probably less.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's not what was expected when she was travelling out there, and I mean you could see, I think obviously, George, you wouldn't necessarily say you're sort of one of Theresa May's greatest fans, but I mean, I think even you'd have to admit there was something very genuine in the anger that she demonstrated in her statement.
Totally, they treated her not with disrespect but with contempt, and therefore they treated Britain with contempt.
No, absolutely. I think that's right, and I say that as someone who voted Remain and has been very concerned with. Myself have been very concerned, and I'm still very concerned about the potential implications of a no-deal Brexit. But frankly, if our supposed EU partners are going to act in this way, and as you say, treat the Prime Minister with contempt, and by extension, the nation with contempt, then frankly, so be it. If they're not going to offer any sort of deal, then a no-deal scenario is the only thing that is on the table.
Now, you're based in Parliament some of the time, and you certainly know what's going on in Parliament. Let's speculate. If Chequers couldn't get through the House of Commons, and I'm certain that it couldn't, because I'm sure that Labour will vote against any deal that Theresa May brings back, at least that'll be the official Labour line. And now that we're into Chequers minus territory, by definition, if the EU won't accept Chequers, they'll want Chequers minus. That can't go through. No deal is a default position, I know, so you don't have to positively vote for no deal. It exists if nothing else is affirmed by the House of Commons. But that puts us into the default of crashing out without a deal, and the consequences of that are bound to be political chaos and the demand for a general election, which may become unstoppable, don't you think?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I think there's actually one scenario that's worse than that. I mean, you said in that summary that there would not need to effectively be a vote on no deal. I'm not entirely sure that's correct. I mean, obviously we had a series of amendments just before the House broke for the summer, in which the sort of the Remainers who were pushing on this did feel that they had secured some concessions from the government on this. I mean, it all got a bit complicated, and it seemed to end up ostensibly in the sort of the gift of the Speaker to decide whether a substantive vote would be required in relation to a no deal. But what I'm concerned about more than anything is we have a situation where the House of Commons rejects even a no deal and effectively tries to force Theresa May, or I think at that point Theresa May would have to resign, a future Prime Minister to go back to the EU and try and renegotiate. Now, as you said, if Chequers is not acceptable to the European Union, then certainly any of the other proposals that are acceptable to certainly the hard right Conservative Party wouldn't be acceptable. I think your assessment about where the Labour Party is at the moment on vetoing anything is probably accurate. So we end up in a situation, we end up in a sort of Brexit purgatory where we can't move forward, we can't move back. I think the other danger is, I mean, you're touching on a general election. There's no guarantee if we have another general election that would resolve the situation either.
No, although that happens in other countries too. It's just we're not as used to it as some other countries. Here's my understanding of the parliamentary procedure, that if no substantive motion gains a majority, then the House adjourns. You could have a vote on the adjournment of the House, and that might be tested as a vote on the no-deal default. But you wouldn't have to positively vote for a no deal for it to come to pass, because Article 50, once triggered, has within it automaticity that at the end of the Article 50 process, we're out of the EU and we would effectively be out without any deal. Now, personally, I'm unmoved by that because I believe in practice that business, industry, exporters in European countries are no more keen on a no-deal Brexit than British industrialists, British business, British exporters are. It's not the end of the world for me. It's not a walk in the park, but it's not the end of the world. But you're right to say that Theresa May would inevitably have to resign. And then the Queen would have to be persuaded that Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson could command a majority in the House to get the Queen's business through. And that would take some persuading, I think.
Well, I mean, I think that the issue is, even if the Queen could be persuaded for Prime Minister Hunt or Prime Minister Boris or Prime Minister Gove or Prime Minister whoever, that of itself does not alter the parliamentary arithmetic within the House of Commons. No. So we're still...
you're right, but we'd be out, Dan. That's my point, because Article 50 has a timeline.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, that's your. Again, I'm not entirely sure I agree with your assessment that we would simply default out in that situation. I mean, I do think. I mean, I certainly know that within Downing Street there is a view now that, and there certainly was a view before this, that if the EU rejected Chequers and rejected what was seen as reasonable attempts by the government to strike a deal, then there actually could at that point potentially be a parliamentary majority for a no deal scenario. I mean, I don't think in these circumstances, I don't think Theresa May would have to resign if, in a sense, she doesn't get a deal. I think she could go on, not for much longer, but I don't think that would necessarily be a resignation moment for her.
You don't think there would be too many Tories who would join Labour and vote down a no-deal Brexit?
No, I actually think it would probably be easier to get a no-deal scenario through the Commons. Firstly, how many Tory rebels would there be in that scenario? I think there would be far fewer Tory rebels in a no-deal scenario than there would be against Brexit. The whole, that ERG bloc would come into line. I also think it would be harder at that point for Labour as well, because Labour's strategy, as you know, is for Labour Remainers to basically vote against any deal and say that's because we oppose Brexit, but also for Labour Leavers to vote against May's deal by mirroring the argument of the Brexiteers that this is not a real Brexit and not the Brexit that people voted for. In a no-deal scenario, at that point, what is Labour going to say? Is Labour as a bloc going to say we would go back cap in hand to the EU, as you said, ask for, give the EU further concessions in the hope that they're nice to us? That would be, in that scenario, that's quite a difficult political position for Labour to be in, I would think.
Dan Hodges, as always, a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much. Dan Hodges, commentator for the Mail on Sunday. Let's take the first caller, Daria in Banbury in Oxfordshire. Daria, welcome.
Hello, George, and thank you for saying my name correctly. You say it lovely with the old brogue.
It's a very lovely name.
Thank you. Right, now you wanted me to call in about remaining or leaving the EU.
Okay, well, that's already decided, I think, Daria. It's a question of how. It's a question of how.
Well, what's this space, eh? Right, now, I voted to remain, and one of the main reasons I did was because of the Human Rights Act of 1998, and in particular Article 6.1, which was the right to a fair trial. Now, interestingly, just before the referendum was made, Keir Starmer actually spoke at a symposium, and the question that was asked was, is a fair trial possible in the UK? Now, I was doing paralegal work at the time, investigating and building defences for innocent men falsely accused. Now, I thought things were going wrong, and their access to legal aid was being reduced. And as it turned out, the Conservative government has made it now impossible for the ordinary man in the street to be able to defend himself because he hasn't got the money to do it. Now, I think I was right in saying remain because it protected, that Human Rights Act is the only protection the ordinary man in the street has against the brutal might of the state.
Well, that's illogical, Daria, because you've just described to us how crushing the justice system is to the ordinary man in the street, and that's while we're in the EU.
That's right, yeah. I hope you haven't misinterpreted me, because Mrs May has now basically said she would scrap the Human Rights Act.
Yeah, but the Human Rights Act is extant now. It exists now. Do you think now that people have got the right to a fair trial in Britain? Your answer is no.
No.
So the EU didn't protect that right at all.
Well, what right would we have? Because she said a bill of human rights.
Well, we are, depending on who our government. We'd get the Human Rights Act that the government we elect decides to draft. But my point is, you have just described eloquently how bad our justice system is while we're in the EU. So why should we remain in the EU when it is presiding over such a terrible justice system?
My fear was when Mrs May said that she would scrap the Human Rights Act 1998, I thought, what rights or what protections would the ordinary man in the street have? That was my fear.
Yeah, but we've got precious few protections now, and we've been in the EU for 40 years. Anyway, it's a pleasure disagreeing with you, Daria, in Banbury. Now, I wanted to speak to my next guest for quite some weeks now, and this is the best night, actually, to have him back on the show. He's Matt Kelley. He's the most plausible of all the Remainers in Britain. Put that on your book, Matt. Matt Kelley of the New European.
Good evening, George. How are you?
I'm good. Now, were you tearful when you watched Theresa May in her Churchill tribute act in Downing Street today?
If it wasn't so crushingly serious, I would be facetious and say I was crying tears of mirth. But no, I can't believe the state we've arrived at, frankly. I think we are looking pathetic and humiliated on the national stage, and it was all so foreseeable as far as I can see.
Now, where does it leave us? I've just been debating with Dan Hodges, former Remainer like you, now persuaded that we better get on with it. He thinks that it will be easier to get a no-deal Brexit motion positively affirmed in the House of Commons than any other motion. Do you share that view?
No, I don't. And I'll tell you why I disagree with Dan, and I also disagree with you, actually, about where Labour need to be on this very interesting situation, is that I think not only have Labour got a golden opportunity now to reverse this catastrophe, but also a moral obligation to do so. Because European socialism has never been in a weaker state. All over Europe, you are seeing the collapse of socialist parties. And
except in Britain, of course.
Except in Britain. The UK is anomalous to this. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, if he truly believes in a anti-austerity socialist Europe, I think has now got a golden opportunity to engage with the European Union, to try and, if we can get Labour to back some sort of reversal, just spin this on its head. At the moment today, we look absolutely powerless and completely lame. However, if we had an opportunity to go back to the European Union, we would never have more leverage than we do today. The European Union would bend over backwards to accommodate us and our return. And Jeremy Corbyn, if he was the leader of Great Britain negotiating that return, would never have a greater opportunity in the last 70 years to help end austerity throughout Europe and give socialist politics a way back to relevance in Europe, where frankly, in Greece, in France, in Germany, in Holland, we have seen the absolute collapse of socialism. In Poland, there doesn't even exist a socialist party. Now, Corbyn,
is that how you spin it to your big business backers that socialism is possible if only Corbyn will come round to your way of thinking?
No. What I'm telling you is, firstly, let me just correct you. We have no big business backers. Only the.
No, I don't mean the newspaper. No. I meant your cause.
Well, okay. Well, let's put that to one side. I mean, my cause is based on a belief that we should engage with Europe. I don't sit here saying the European Union is by any means perfect or even close to perfect, but I think the best way is to engage with Europe. We've been so influential in the past. half of the things that the Brexiteers were campaigning against were things that we insisted on negotiating. Now, I think if walking away at this stage, if there's an opportunity to turn this around, because we all know, I believe no deal will cause an economic dislocation that will cost thousands and thousands of jobs. And I see now the unions picking up on this and very clearly putting pressure on Labour, getting very twitchy about what may come to pass under a no deal. If there is a chance to engage with Europe and to make Europe a more socialist place, then why not? It was New Labour that shifted Europe to the centre, to the right. Why couldn't Corbynism shift it back to the left?
Now, how do you suppose that he should do this? By coming out now for what you call a people's vote?
Yes, I do. And I think there's an ethical logic to a people's vote now. I think if people genuinely have changed their minds, and by the way, if no deal is starting to look like the likely option, I think you'd have to be a very, very strange character not to get very concerned about this enormous gamble we're about to take as a nation. And I don't believe for a second that ordinary people in the northeast of England, in Wales, in the north of England, in Scotland, are sitting there thinking, do you know what, I still really feel up for this enormous gamble that is going to affect me and my kids and their kids. So I think you will see opinion shift away from Brexit, especially if the only option is no deal. So then, yes, I think not only would it be morally right to give people another say and an opportunity to either confirm or to reject the way we're going, but it would be an election winner for Corbyn by a million miles.
Yeah, but you wouldn't get an election. Isn't that the point, Matt? That if you vote down everything, anything, which I think is the Labour position, by the way, and I think they're right. Yeah. They're right for that to be the position. If you vote down everything, you could bring about a general election. That's the real people's vote, isn't it?
But, well, I'm not convinced that a general election would resolve anything, to be honest. And I agree with Dan on this point. I think a general election, obviously, is such a broad vote. It would be a very strange general election where everybody was understood that it was on the topic of Brexit. And, of course, I think Labour's great abrogation of opposition in the last general election was basically having exactly the same Brexit policy as the Tories. So,
the 5 million Labour voters, Matt, voted Brexit.
Well, 2/3 voted Remain. 2/3 of Labour constituencies voted Brexit, but 2/3 of Labour supporters want to Remain, and that's as of 2016.
No, I'm telling you, I'm talking about individual voters. 5 million Labour voters voted for Brexit. Do you think Labour's going to kiss them goodbye in the hope of some macchiato drinking former Liberals replacing them? I don't think so.
George, honestly, I can't compete with you for the aspersions you cast on reasonable people with reasonable political
They're the best shod. They're the best shod with a whiff of macchiato as they go by you. Demonstrators I've ever seen in my entire life.
Listen, you're almost certainly right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong.
Doesn't mean they're not nice people, that's true.
It doesn't mean they're not nice people.
Matt,
and I would...
Matt, I've run out of time, I'm afraid, because it's a very crowded show, but it's a pleasure to talk to you again. I repeat, you are the most plausible Remainer I've ever encountered. Matt Kelley, editor of the New European. Let me go to some of the messages which are absolutely flowing in. James Ball says, I agree, George, we should have just triggered and Brexited without tariffs on either side. Much of the temporary pain would have been over by this point. Moreover, James, let me make this point. How about getting a bus out on the road discussing what we're going to do with the 40 billion pounds we're not now going to give to the EU for the privilege of leaving their bankers club? Because there's no way anyone will tolerate a no-deal Brexit being forced upon the country by the EU, and we're still going to pay them 40 billions. For what? So that means we've got 40 billions to spend. I've got some good ideas on what we could do with that money. Here's Daniel in Addlestone. Go ahead, Daniel.
Good evening, George. How are you?
I'm good. I'm firing on all cylinders.
Magic. No, I was going to say about with this Brexit, they're planning for civil unrest, aren't they? There's a lot of these like memos or whatever. And
I don't think the Hush Puppy Brigade and their macchiato classes are going to create any unrest. Do you, Daniel?
I hope not. I mean, again, my mind goes back to those riots of 2012, wasn't it?
Yeah, and, but these chaps, the whiff of expensive cologne and their chiffon scarves and so on, they're not going to be rioting.
But then, wouldn't it? Because then all of those returning jihadists and that will come out of the woodworks, and we have to have more surveillance, and we have to have armed police on the streets now to keep everyone
Daniel,
safe.
aren't you being a trifle alarmist?
I know, George, and I a bit of anxiety because of, it's a crazy world we live in, and
well, we've got returning jihadists. We've got returning jihadists already here, and more fool us for having empowered those jihadists and allowing them to return.
Come back.
But
sorry, George. I will say I don't want to be an alarmist. I do worry, but I don't want to be an alarmist.
Well, look, I agree with Theresa May. Words you never thought you'd hear. Leaving the EU without a deal would not be a walk in the park, but neither is it the end of the world. I mean, I think we really need to have some national self-confidence in this.
Well, I think they were saying that Nigel Farage was saying, wasn't it, that, maybe, should actually start believing in ourselves as, in England.
Even a stopped clock is right twice a day.
Twice a day, 100%.
And Nigel Farage may well be right on that. Here's Peter on SMS. The EU will never give a good deal to the UK. It's obvious why they can't, because there are several countries itching to leave the EU, and they must set an example with the UK and show the others what happens when you try to leave. It's like a turkey voting for Christmas. They will never give a good deal. It would be the beginning of the end of the EU. I have met with EU politicians in the past, and from my own experience I can tell you it's a boys' club for the elite, funded by the tax-paying people of its members, with one aim and one aim only: to have a centralised government controlling every other country, with each country losing its sovereignty forever. And John in Lancashire says, re-Jaguar's threat. If it is essential for UK vehicle manufacturers to be in the EU, why in 2013 did Ford close their Southampton Transit van factory, biggest selling European van for 40 years, and relocate it to Turkey, outside the EU? Brilliant. Also, betting for the next Tory leader is Boris Johnson at 4 or 5 to 1. Sajid Javid at 6 to 1. That's a ridiculous price. He'll never get it, not in a month of Sundays. Jacob Rees-Mogg, 9 to 1. He won't run. Michael Gove, 12 to 1. And Jeremy Hunt and Dominic Raab at 14 to 1. That's quite an interesting set of prices there. I'll get down to the bookies in the morning on that, John. Thank you. Mal says, George, no party in Britain has come up with any alternative other than staying in the European Union and going against a democratic vote. This is a poisoned chalice which no party can negotiate with this load of gangsters. They laugh at us and as good as want us to bend over for a whipping with our trousers down. Thank God Theresa May stood up today against the 27 and gave them our own ultimatum, says Mal in Belfast. I don't want to mix that image in my mind of trousers down, bent over, whipping, and Theresa May. But what I will say to you is this, Mal. The Labour Party stood at the last election 1 year ago accepting the result of the referendum. The Liberal Democrats stood and on a proposal, on a platform of rejecting the EU referendum result. Labour scored its best result since 1945. The Liberal Democrats lost a record number of deposits, and their parliamentary party is as it looks to you now this minute. Let me get some more. So much coming in. My old friend Marie McFarlane says the EU did not invent the Human Rights Act in 1998. The Council of Europe has dealt with international human rights since 1949. There's often a deliberate confusion here, as the EU stole the logo. Very good point. And David Leviscott says, your caller who was talking about fair trials is talking rubbish. We've just bombed Syria with no trial or evidence at all. What kind of fair trial is she referring to? I have no idea. And Terry Eaton says, George, your opening remarks about the unification of the 26 and the 6 in Ireland were absolutely correct. The DUP would not be propping up our government, and the whole of Ireland could happily stay in the EU. And Albert Trigg says, what is this man on about? This is complete fantasy. The EU cannot be reformed. It would take socialist governments coming to power simultaneously and then to completely rewrite the treaties and directives in order to change the EU. That was my point, Albert, that Matt talks a good game because he's talking to me and he's talking to you, but that's not what is being said by the rest of the Remain camp. Do you think Tony Blair's out there saying Jeremy Corbyn should save socialism in Europe, end austerity in Europe by backing a people's vote? It's absolutely preposterous. By the way, there is another socialist party doing rather well in the European Union. It's called the Portuguese Socialist Party. Portugal has a left-wing government which has already broken from austerity, and Portugal's economy has risen like a phoenix from the ashes. And there are other European countries, in Italy, in Hungary, and many other places, which if they could, they'd be up and off, out of the EU. Try telling the people of Greece just how social democratic the European Union is. Now, England's difficulty is historically Ireland's opportunity, and one man who knows about that is Kevin Marr, British and Irish political commentator and author of a fantastic book, which I commend to you, called A United Ireland, Why Unification is Inevitable and How It Will Come About. And he joins us now. Kevin, you must be, even secretly, quite pleased the way things are going, because the thesis of your book can never have been closer.
Good evening, George. Quite. I think we certainly live in interesting times, and I think what Brexit is clearly doing is galvanising a lot of the disintegration of the UK, whether that be Scotland, of course, or whether that be Northern Ireland, and the opinion polls are certainly reflecting that, I think, in terms of the changing views of significant numbers of people. So yes, these are extraordinary times. We've seen this week, I think, again, a British Prime Minister, as Aaron Bevan famously put it, sent naked into the chamber over at Salzburg at the EU summit, and Theresa May left in a very, very difficult position, I think, today. Midweek, she was talking up the prospect of getting over this hurdle on the Irish border question and getting Brexit into the kind of endgame territory. And of course, she comes back today and is no further forward effectively than she was 6 months ago. And that was a remark made by Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, the other day. So we live in interesting times. There's still an awful lot of variables that are very, very hard to read on all this. But certainly one of them is that it makes, I think, the case for Irish reunification a lot easier than it would have done perhaps a few years ago.
I mean, sometimes irresistible forces do meet immovable objects, and this Conservative government is only the government because of the lifeline thrown to it, a kind of orange sash tossed across the sea, which they grasped at very great expense to the taxpayer in the DUP coalition agreement. So Theresa May literally cannot sacrifice her position on maintaining partition in Ireland, and yet the Irish government and the European Union will not sacrifice their stand on customs and trading relations between the EU and Britain, which has left it.
Exactly. I mean, Theresa May is probably putting off more people from ever aspiring to become Prime Minister of Great Britain than anyone in her history. She's in a very, very difficult position, and part of that position is the vicissitudes of fate, and some of it, frankly, is because of her own making. But yes, exactly. She's in a position where she's got a significant chunk of her party that are moving towards hardening their position towards, let's just leave the European Union at any cost. to the leaving others aghast in her party. She's got to try and manage that because, of course, she doesn't have a parliamentary majority, and as you allude, she's reliant on the 10 votes of the Democratic Unionist Party, which is implacably opposed to any deal that will see Northern Ireland diminished as part of the United Kingdom, which is the easy way for her or for any British Prime Minister of resolving this issue.
Indeed,
if
you said now,
in the customs union,
if you said to the EU now, okay, the border between Britain and the European Union will be in the middle of the Irish Sea, that would resolve the entire question. So the whole of Britain, all its economy, all its peoples, are being held to ransom for a population the size. I mean, the DUP vote is what, 300,000? 300,000 people are their interests, their demands are being prioritized over the actual needs, desires, and the whole future of 65 million people.
I mean, to put this into numbers, you're looking at Northern Ireland constitutes around 3% of the UK's population, and so if you sort of said the DUP, the Unionist community, who by all means are not all DUP and not all ardent Brexiteers, but it's 1.5% effectively half of Northern Ireland, 1.5% of the UK population. Northern Ireland constitutes about 1.5% of the UK economy. And this 1.5% is holding up progress for the 98.5% of the rest of us. And in a sense, that's Theresa May's big calculation. My reading of this is that in the final analysis, she's going to have to decide whether she wants to cut a deal which perhaps the DUP and some of her conservative backbenchers don't like, but actually delivers something that the UK can live with and British business can deal with. Or we go down the other road where she holds the line, and she was certainly rattling her sabre this afternoon in a remarks at Downing Street. She holds that line, and we end up with a hard Brexit. We end up with potential chaos. We end up with a potential flight of capital and investment from Britain. The Tory party loses its reputation as a party of business. Perhaps the government falls, and the situation becomes calamitous politically for her and her government. Now, I think in that scenario between the devil and the deep blue sea, I think what she will have to look at again is there a way of placating unionist opinion where she may be able to say to them, look, I can resolve this issue and repay you in lots and lots of ways, and Northern Ireland is anomalous within the UK in lots and lots of ways already. It is not a big thing. It is not necessarily leading you inexorably to United Ireland on this particular issue, frankly, to keep Northern Ireland in the customs union and just resolve this issue for the whole of the UK. It will be a great service to her personally, to her government, and actually for everybody, I think, living in Britain, because the alternative is we start hurtling towards that cliff edge, that no-deal Brexit, and from that point onwards, we end up in a political and economic vortex.
Let's look at the alternative to that. Britain reimposes effectively a hard border between the 6 counties and the rest of Ireland. That is going to be the highest possible risk. It actually risks peace. It actually risks a return to war in the north of Ireland. Are there people in the north of Ireland up for that?
I mean, you look at that. You look at that scenario, which I think anybody that follows these things in Northern Ireland does, and I think you would be just aghast at the prospect we might get there. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, or even your word, George. You can look at the remarks of the Police Federation in Northern Ireland, which has said that any hard border arrangement would make their officers sitting ducks. It will become a prelude to, I suspect, dissident Republicans attacking the border or any border infrastructure. And of course, remember 6 months ago we had the Brexit Secretary David Davis and plenty Conservative MPs said, don't worry about it, there'll be minimal infrastructure on the Irish border. Well, of course, if you know your Irish history, the IRA border campaign of the late 1950s and early 1960s had these tactics of destroying assets and electricity infrastructure along that border as a symbolic gesture. So yes, it leads to a very bad situation. It undermines the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement, which is in part based upon both Britain and Ireland being member states of the European Union. And of course, Northern Ireland has benefited enormously from being in the European Union, not least the fact that it brings in something like 600 million euros a year in funding, which is agricultural subsidies and all kinds of other social funding for Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland gets a very good deal. That is all set to go the day we leave the European Union, which is a dramatic effect in and of itself. But frankly, what really happens with Northern Ireland is that if you're a company based there, if you're a manufacturer there, you will simply look and say, I can move 10 miles down the road into the Irish Republic, where I can get much lower corporation tax rates, I can get much more generous subsidies, and I've got automatic access to the single market, which, of course, we will lose when we leave the European Union. So Northern Ireland will wither on the vine economically, which is bad enough. But, of course, it's the effect of destabilising the politics in Northern Ireland, which is, a place we really don't want to go to.
Well, now, that all sounds like very high-stakes stuff. Are the Irish politicians, I've asked you this before, are the Irish politicians stepping up to the challenge of this? I would have expected far more for example, I tweeted earlier today that the only sane border between Britain and the EU is down the middle of the Irish Sea and Irish reunification and so on. It got only a few hundred retweets, whereas I often get, I can often get tens of thousands of retweets. Are Irish people and Irish political organisations not using this opportunity, this England's difficulty?
I think there's a degree of avoiding the hard questions in Dublin amongst the Dublin political class. Frankly, I think they're always aware that Irish unity is an issue that they're going to have to grapple with at some stage, but it's always let's put it off until tomorrow. And I think what Brexit does is just throw into sharp relief all these broader trends, which I argue will eventually lead to Irish reunification anyway. But Brexit is an accelerant. It just pushes the agenda. It makes these issues very, very immediate. And I think there's still some foot dragging in Irish politics about the full implications of all this. Now, I mean, you look at some of the opinion polls of the last few months. There is a general narrowing between people who in Northern Ireland, of people who want to remain in the UK, people who want to become part of a united Ireland. But the interesting poll for me a couple of months ago was between 18 or 44-year-olds, so people who've got a stake in the future, if I can put it bluntly like that. Now this is Protestants, this is nationalists, this is unionists, this is youngish people. Now the idea that you can leave the UK, be part of a united Ireland, and automatically rejoin the European Union, 56% of people wanted that to happen. To remain part of in Northern Ireland, part of the UK, outside the European Union, 34%. That is a big, dramatic change that's happening that is coming up hot on the heels with the next generation, and it won't take very long for that to start to feed through. And when that starts to happen, under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, we're going to be at the point where there will have to be a border poll on the constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland's status. And when that happens, I think Brexit will provide a very, very strong secondary reason for people in Northern Ireland to vote to become part of a united Ireland, because not only the people who are very passionate about being part of a single Irish state, fine, but the secondary issue is you get to rejoin the European Union automatically. And that's been very, very clear since the start of these Brexit negotiations. And I think that is a very powerful new dynamic in this calculation, where lots of people, maybe from the Protestant Unionist perspective, will look at this and say, it might not be everything I want, but it's what I can live with. I would rather be in the European Union, to have an EU passport, to have more job opportunities, to be able to open a business and be part of the single market, and all the rest of it. And that is more important to me. Those bread and butter issues are more important to me than perhaps the more obscure issues about sovereignty and being part of a historical connection with the UK. So this is what Brexit has delivered for unionism, effectively, a very, very strong secondary reason for there to be a united Ireland.
Kevin Marr, author of A United Ireland, Why Unification is Inevitable and How It Will Come About. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Sean is on the line from South East London. Welcome, Sean. What would you like to say?
Hey, Sean. George.
Welcome.
First of all, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I think you're a bit of a hero of the left, to be honest. And a couple of things I was going to say. I really want there to be a general election, but I think the establishment will do all they can not to let one happen, because I think Corbyn's going to win.
Yeah, sure, but facts are cheels that win a ding, as we say in Scotland. If you don't have a parliamentary majority, if you can't get the Queen's business through the Parliament, then a general election becomes inevitable. And I don't see how anyone else in the Conservative Party could plausibly convince the Queen that they could do better than she. We now have reached, as Theresa May said today, an impasse. And the only way to resolve an impasse is a general election. And if that doesn't resolve it, another general election.
No, it's a really good point. I just think surely the Queen would prefer, my understanding would prefer a Tory than Corbyn and that's why I think maybe they'd let someone like Hunt, as mad as he is, carry on, and maybe take the reins. But the only good thing I think about that, which I think another point that I think you might find interesting, is it gives more time for the Labour Party to democratise, and I'm hoping mandatory reselection, or whatever form it takes, goes through conference. I know there's going to be a bit of a struggle, but that's the only good thing I can think. The longer it will take for a general election, the more socialists we get in the Labour Party.
Well, you touch on an issue that inevitably arises if we have a general election soon. If we have a general election soon, the Parliamentary Labour Party will be the same Parliamentary Labour Party we've got now, plus a few more. And the Parliamentary Labour Party we have now is overwhelmingly against Jeremy Corbyn. And therefore, Corbyn and MacDonald would find it very difficult indeed to persuade their MPs to implement their policies. And in amongst that overwhelming majority, you've got 40, 50, maybe slightly more, really hardcore enemies of Corbyn that would act as a group to block and frustrate a Corbyn government. That's true.
Yeah. Exactly, and I think there's the core enemies, and then there's the melts, as I call them, as in, they'd probably cheer on a war to if there was a manufactured crisis, they would melt away and leave Corbyn hanging on there. It's like with the serious stuff at the minute. I think to a lot of people it's quite obvious that our business over there is purely for just foreign relations interest. We don't have any.
Well, never mind that.
Reasons,
leave aside the foreign affairs. There are dozens of Labour MPs, for example, who would not dream of changing Britain's role in NATO, its embrace of the Trident nuclear submarine system. They would not want to see taxes imposed on the richest people and the richest corporations. They would not want to see changes in media law, which Corbyn has suggested. They would not want to see the changes that Corbyn has just announced on gambling in Britain, because they were part of the ramp which turned Britain into a gambling mania capital of the world in the first place. It's often missed that these figures of rectitude, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, transformed Britain into a Las Vegas so far as gambling is concerned. And that was,
right.
A lot of MPs will not support Corbyn trying to change that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Can I ask you one thing? One more thing?
Sure.
So I'm a believer in Irish reunification.
Mm-hmm.
If that happens, what happens? Surely, Ireland would still be under control of the EU, and they would have to accept the euro, which my understanding has crippled a lot of countries, and especially Ireland got a pretty bad deal from being in the EU.
Well, if I was in Ireland, I'd be campaigning for Irexit, I don't want Ireland to remain in the European Union any more than I want Britain to remain in it. But the decision on that is for the Irish. And all the signs are that North and South, the majority want to remain in the European Union. And that's a matter for them, I think, Sean. Anyway, thanks for your call, mate. Let's go to Ireland, to Belfast, where Marty is on the line. Go ahead, Marty.
Hi, George. Good to speak to you again.
And
Great
you,
show
sir.
as usual.
Thank you.
And Kevin Meagher, obviously a go-to person these days when it comes to Irish politics.
Well, yeah, he's going to be busy in the media, I think, over the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, the Labour Party need to make good use of Kevin Meagher, I think.
Yeah, they should be making far more use of him than they are.
Of course. Listen, I disagree with you. Normally, I agree with you. I disagree with you on this EU thing. Now, I agree with your overall analysis, of course, that it's a bankers' club, a capitalist, all that stuff, the neoliberal nonsense. But I for all of what these sort of FBPE people are saying, it really annoys me. But Matt Kelley, I think, made a good point, and it's not to be sniffed at, which was about if Corbyn is elected, Britain actually could show the way to all of us, both here in Ireland and right across Europe. If Corbyn is elected, it kind of reminds me of what happened in the 90s, and this is before Blair went rogue, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Before Blair was elected, I remember the whole sort of 1990s, that Major period, John Major, and all the other sort of stale governments around the European Union. And Blair came along, and he did provide hope, let's face it, he did at the time. He came in, and then Europe kind of followed suit, and they elected centre-left governments right across the piece.
And how did that work out?
Well, I know what you're saying, and I know the argument. The point I'm making is, if a real proper left government in a major country like Britain, and I take your point about Portugal, and I know about Greece, I take the point there. I think Cyprus in Greece is crying out for partners around Europe, and Varoufakis is making that point tonight. The progressives around the world, not just in the EU, need a Jeremy Corbyn government. That's my view. And here in Ireland, north and south, I mean, the whole question of Irish unity, Kevin Meagher made the point to you, it's not even being reported on that the opinion polls here are through the roof. I can't believe it.
Well, look,
I grew up in
Marty,
troubles, George.
If you forgive me, I think that's a contradiction, your argument. You should be welcoming Britain leaving the European Union, not trying to stop it, because it is the accelerator of Irish reunification. You should be saying hallelujah that Britain is leaving the EU if you want to see Irish reunification. Secondly, you say that you want to see a Corbyn government. The fastest way to get a Corbyn government is to get the earliest possible general election. If Corbyn now throws, as Matt Kelley wants him to throw, a lifeline to Theresa May for a second referendum which will take place 12 months later, and may, of course, also resolve nothing, then actually that's putting off a general election. Labour MPs have got the chance to bring the government down, and that's what they should be focused on, nothing else. Why give the Tories a lifeboat of a people's vote referendum?
No, I agree with that, and I think that there should be a general election. And my point about Corbyn transforming or helping to transform the European continent, if Corbyn's in government, I expect Jeremy Corbyn to live up to his lifelong ambitions and arguments about Ireland, which is very close to what Tony Benn very reasonably, always the voice of reason actually in English politics when it came to the position of Ireland. I think that Corbyn would deliver on a United Ireland. I would expect him to offer, in the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, a poll on a United Ireland. So, and for him to argue that it's the same thing and the good thing and the right way to go. So that's what I would expect from a Jeremy Corbyn Labour government. And it brings me to something else, that the Labour Party should get off the fence on this issue. They should be arguing that a United Ireland is their policy again. Tony Blair changed the policy the Labour Party policy on this in 1998 in order to get the Good Friday Agreement through the Ulster Unionist Party. They haven't changed it back. They have never changed it back. Corbyn should change it back in the Labour Party conferences. Maybe not this weekend because it's too soon, but next year or whenever they should change their policy.
I agree entirely. I suppose in his defence, I'd have to say he has had rather a lot on his plate, Marty, without putting that one on the table so far. But I agree entirely with what you say. Let's hear from Pat in East London. Go ahead, Pat.
Oh, good evening, George. Look, I'm with you. I think Ireland should be united because, well, I mean, it was once upon a time, wasn't it?
It was us that divided it.
Yeah, but the thing that I mean, while we've got Northern Ireland, we've got something to defend if the island of Ireland was threatened, you know, militarily.
Who's going to threaten the island of Ireland?
Well, you know, if because all I'm saying is that if it became a united Ireland, I would like to insist on them having at least a small air force and navy element that they could defend our western flank from whoever, you know, not just to defend themselves, but to defend the mainland itself.
It's not the Second World War, Pat. I mean, war doesn't work like that anymore. If we're in a war and the only conceivable war we could be in is a nuclear war, trust me, the Irish Sea ain't much of a barrier. Anyway, you and I agree on that, but other people may not. If you think that Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK, then I want to hear from you. 0344 499 1000. If you believe that I'm wrong on this, and Marty is wrong, and Pat is wrong, and Kevin is wrong, then tell us, either by calling us on 0344 499 1000 or emailing, texting or tweeting. I really do want the widest possible representation of views on this. Let me take some more of the written material. Don in Aberdeenshire says, regardless of one's political persuasion or their view of Theresa May or Brexit, seems to me that the behaviour of the EU leaders at the Salzburg summit was frankly rude and juvenile. If this is a measure of the way in which they operate, then why would anybody want to be a member of their anachronistic, puerile, scruffy little club? Certainly not a country like the UK. Well, look, Don, a scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. The EU leaders behaved like they did because they're the EU. And by the way, it's not a scruffy little club. Nothing. If you've ever been to the European Union, and I have, I've been in the Commission building, I've been in the European Parliament building, scruffy is what it is definitely not. It is the most svelte, the most luxurious, the best funded bankers' club on the planet Earth. And as for rude and juvenile, it was contemptuous. It was contemptible. And as to paraphrase Groucho Marx, any club that behaved like that, I wouldn't want to be a member of. Big Al says, George, please tell me what Matt Kelley does not understand about a vote outcome. Let me explain this to him. It's a result. It's a final decision. It's the way forward to move on. A vote does not mean you can have another vote if you didn't like the outcome. The man made me laugh out loud. And Doc Moonshine says, I think it was Sir Paul McCartney who sang Give Ireland Back to the Irish. That would be a day of celebration amidst all this mess, and it would serve the British government right. The BBC banned that song, of course. Andrew says, if a general election makes Corbyn the PM and we're still in the EU, renationalisation of the railways would still be prohibited by the EU. Well said. And the revolution will not be televised says, there is no way that under the EU constitution a real shift to socialism could come. It's entrenched neoliberalism and undemocratic government is too strong. Let's hear from Peter in Wigan. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, hi, George.
Nice to hear from you. Go on.
Yeah, and I'd like to congratulate you on getting everything spot on.
Thank you, mate.
Your analysis, as usual, is absolutely impeccable. I penned a few comments for a newspaper, blog earlier on today, and it quickly got removed.
Yeah.
But if I can just read it out to you, and some of it might echo what you've been saying. I know you prefer arguments, but...
No, go on.
The brutal and undignified public humiliation of Theresa May at Salzburg should leave no one in any doubt about the determination of the multi-billion EU bureaucracy and its serial gravy train apparatchiks to make an example of the UK and deliver a strong warning to others who might dare to step out of line. We should remember the appalling treatment meted out to the Greek people. Even before Bullingdon boy David Cameron did a runner, the UK Tory government had demonstrated that it can't run a party in a brewery. Under deluded Theresa May, the Tories have fought amongst themselves like rats in a sack, inflicted untold damage on the British people, and prevaricated to the point where the UK has become a laughingstock throughout the world. What is needed now is a general election and a strong government that will stand up to the EU bully boys and leave the EU with dignity, a deal or no deal, and it's clear that it's going to be a no deal. The perennial issue of the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland can be resolved once the Tories and their religious extremist DUP cronies have been kicked out of government.
Well, a powerful piece. I'm sure that's why it was removed. Peter in Wigan, thanks for that excellent call. Tommy is in County Tyrone. Tommy, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George.
Hi there.
Much admired your show. Listen to you every week.
Thanks, Tommy.
Second to none.
Thank you, sir.
George, you were talking about you wanted to speak to someone, as far as Northern Ireland goes, but wanting to remain part of the UK.
Yes, I did, yes.
Well, George, I'm a nationalist from the north of Ireland. You know the backstory of how we want to unite Ireland and all the rest.
I know.
George,
my mother's Irish, by the way, Tommy.
Yeah, I know that. I actually texted you earlier on. I'm asking you where she hailed from. Never knew where she hailed from.
Waterford.
George. There you go. Very nice part of the country.
Yeah.
Listen, George. As far as people wanting to get out of Ireland, nobody wants it any more than I do. Right? That's been honest. But in my heart of hearts, George, after the way that the Irish government treated their people, at the behest of the EU during the recession.
Very good point.
As you can see what went on, everyone knows how that all went on. It's still going on yet.
What are they paying to go to the doctor in Ireland?
George, I couldn't tell you because
it's plenty just to go and see the doctor.
Absolutely, and in different parts of the country, I'm sure that price varies greatly.
Austerity ravaged the public services in the Republic of Ireland, and that austerity was imposed by the EU.
It was, George.
I don't understand why the Irish are so mad for the EU. George,
the Irish government couldn't jump quick enough to meet their demands. They're still doing it today.
Yeah.
The way they treat the people, I wouldn't want that government treating me like that. I know that it's bad enough, living all your life, in a country that you don't want to be in, but I don't know. I don't think, these days they don't treat us as bad as they would down south. That's only my genuine opinion,
No, well, I think that's a very good point, that the situation in the Irish Republic, the governments that you've had, the devastation to the economy and particularly to public services. I mean, I read all the time about homelessness, evictions, closures of public facilities and so on.
Yeah.
And then you add the payments for the health service and so on. Then rejoining the Irish Republic, because that's what it would be. It was the British that partitioned it. It would be rejoining the Irish whole would be less attractive than it might be to some people. On the other hand, we have now here a situation where the majority in the occupied 6 counties believe that they should stay in the EU. The majority in the Irish Republic want to stay in the EU. Well, the obvious solution to that is for the partition, the border to be withdrawn.
Yeah, and then in the middle of the whole thing, George, we're unique in the way that we have an opportunity in the north of Ireland to actually get the best of both worlds. You know, and due to the fact that the government, the party that's propping up the government at the moment, you know, they don't want that.
Well, we'll see.
You know,
we'll see. I mean, it was being proposed earlier by Kevin Marr that it may well be that Thatcher has to compensate. I think we know what he meant. The DUP handsomely in order to fund, if you like, a sellout of their preferred stand on the border if we're going to avoid a hard Brexit. I personally, I would think that was a price worth paying myself. Tommy in County Tyrone, thank you very much indeed for that. Here's a text without a name, I think. George, I fear if Scotland goes independent, Britain will be surrounded by the EU from all sides. Then they could really bully us. I don't think Scotland will become independent, but it's entitled to a referendum anytime it likes. Christina says, I wish George Galloway would have explained to me what the phrase a border down the middle of the Irish Sea means. I hear this phrase a lot and I'm not entirely sure what it means. Well, it means instead of the border between Britain and the EU being across the line of the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, the border between Britain and the EU be, mythically of course, drawn down the middle of the Irish Sea. It means that Ireland would be one country and Britain would be another country. Britain would be out of the EU and Ireland would be in the EU. That's what it means. Plenty of countries have a border between them down the middle of a sea. It saves money. You don't have to build any border posts or defend them. Well, look, we're getting towards now the end of the second hour. I need more calls, especially from those that disagree with me. First-time callers are also prioritised. Women callers are prioritised. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You call us and we'll arrange a time with you to call you back, put you on the air, not just across this country and Ireland, but across the world. There's people listening to this literally all over the world. Dee, welcome.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Hi. Listen, I just wanted to get your feedback on something.
Yeah.
I did get it before. It's really about Corbyn. I'm a reluctant admirer of him. I'd like to vote for him. I did last time for the first time. I'd like to vote for him another time. You told me that he can't declare that he's a Brexiteer, or he can't declare it out because he's surrounded by, enemies. But basically, you've told me that the conference is just about to come up. People are going to pressure him for a people's vote. If he does go for this people's vote, will you still support it?
But
he won't go for it.
No, definitely
okay,
not.
Okay.
Because
well, what about the scenario?
This would be throwing a lifeline to Theresa May.
Corbyn
has a chance to get her out of Downing Street. So why would he throw her a lifeline?
All right, let's go to that scenario, because a couple of callers back, you said that if it went to the vote, her deal, and it went to a sort of stalemate, she'd have to throw an election, which is what Corbyn wants. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, he still can't declare himself if he gets to go. He's surrounded by Remainers, Momentum.
Well, look, first thing to say,
Adonis.
No, you're right. The first thing to say is if he did put it to the conference this weekend, he would lose. So you should be grateful he's not putting it to the conference.
Right, fair, I understand that. But he gets to an election, sometime or other, he has to
his line, D, is that the only people's vote that matters, given that a second referendum would raise more problems than it would solve, and may even, and I happen to believe it would, result in a bigger majority to leave the EU than was achieved the last time. But it wouldn't resolve the divisions. It wouldn't resolve anything at all. And if it went the other way, it would leave 17 million people embittered forever that the decision they made had been robbed from them.
Right.
So he's not going to do that. His view is the only people's vote that matters is a general election.
Fine. So it comes down to a general election. Does he declare then, or because he's still got momentum around him?
But then we're already out, We're out in 6 months. That's ineluctable. That cannot be stopped. And we're out with no deal in 6 months.
Yeah, but they want to return. They want another vote to go back in, and that's what they'll want to voting for. All those youth in Momentum, Diane Abbott, they all want to go back in.
Yeah, I think a lot of them do, and I don't quite understand why. But if Corbyn is the Prime Minister in 6 months' time, I promise you his first act is not going to be to reopen the question of the EU. That would be the worst possible. Well, but that would be the worst possible start
to a
Corbyn government.
Well, how many people are going to vote him in if he's not saying that I want to reverse the vote?
He's not going to say that.
They'll all pressure
he
him
said
to
the opposite, Dee. He ran for election 12 months ago, explicitly accepting the result of the referendum.
But he wants to stay in the single market.
No, he doesn't want to stay in the single market.
Well,
he wants to stay in a single market, not the single. No, it isn't. It's not the same thing at all. No. The single market is the existing single market. Corbyn wants a different single market, one which doesn't require Britain to go on accepting the free movement of cheap East and Central European Union labour.
Right.
That's the kind of central market he wants.
Why aren't the unions backing that?
Well, that's a very good question. The RMT,
the
Fire Brigade Union are the only two unions.
I know, and why isn't Diane Abbott backing that? Why isn't Momentum backing that?
Well, don't get me started on Momentum.
No, I know, but it's just like he's got enemies all...
Yeah, well, he doesn't have, and neither does McDonnell, very many supporters in the Parliamentary Labour Party. And as you've rightly said, even in his own circle, there are people who, for one reason or another, have fallen madly in love with the European Union. But we'll be out of the European Union before...
By the time the election is there, you really think so?
Yeah, before we get a general
Okay,
election,
well, all right. I just wanted some reassurance, I guess. I don't know.
It's my job to reassure you, Dee.
Okay, then. Well, listen,
basis.
I might phone you again when he declares after
you can phone me anytime you like. Thank you. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back. Now, let me read some more. This is from Tony. GG, like you, I have an Irish mother, but I fear a united Ireland will be treated like Greece by the EU. Well, then the Irish could decide to leave. They'd be well advised to, in my opinion. George, I think we agree about a lot of things, but not Brexit. Brexit, especially a no-deal Brexit, will be an absolute economic disaster. Labour want to be nowhere near this catastrophe when it inevitably comes to pass. The last thing Labour need is a general election where they take power before next April, unless they plan to stop Brexit. If they take power before Brexit and do not manage to halt it, or have time for a second referendum, then they will be inheriting a poisoned chalice. They'll be forever blamed for the aftermath in the same way they are unfairly blamed for austerity following the crash in 2008. Not at all. The contrary. If Corbyn comes to power after we have left the European Union, or when it's too late to stop us leaving the European Union, he'll be able to blame the Tories for any negative consequences. And he will. Just think about that. 0344 499. We're going to talk to Mike Graham, my colleague at Talk Radio. He's furious at my proselytising for a united Ireland, and he's going to come in and say so, I'm glad to say, over the course of the next hour. But mainly, the next hour is yours. Though we are going to squeeze in a subject of great interest to me, space travel. Because see, if this Brexit doesn't work out, I'm thinking of taking off for the heavens. We'll be looking at Elon Musk's space plans with Sue Nelson, a space journalist and author of Wally Funk's Race for Space. I must say that sounds fun. I haven't heard of that book yet, but I'm sure we're going to. But Malfunctioning Marionette says, good question from an earlier caller, how has Portugal sorted its economic problems and elected a socialist government while being part of the EU? Well, the EU actually told the President of Portugal that he must not appoint the current governing coalition in Portugal. But the President told them to get stuffed. And we now have a left-wing government in Portugal which is ignoring EU strictures on the economy. So far, it's gotten away with it because the EU bureaucracy does not want to add Portugal to the EU's current problems, but it may not do so forever. Now, last text, I've got time. Yeah, Sarah. Momentum have been solid. There wouldn't be info and campaigning for Corbyn without them. Well, there's many, many good people in Momentum. My issue is with the people who own it. And boy, do I mean own it. It's a private company. It's actually owned by someone. How's that feel, Sarah? Now, for my television show, which goes out tomorrow, I interviewed a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, a lady by the name of Jane Green. She brought props, the moon, the earth, and she talked mesmerically about the universe, a subject which I'm increasingly interested in. But that doesn't mean we neglect the moon. In fact, one of the questions I asked her is why we haven't gone back to the moon. But Elon Musk is planning to do so. And Sue Nelson, who's not just a space journalist, how cool is that for a title? Space journalist. But she's the author of Wally Funk's Race for Space. And she joins us now. Sue, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell us about that wonderfully entitled book, first of all. What is Wally Funk's Race for Space? And who is Wally Funk?
Well, Wally Funk is a woman with the name of Wally, who was one of the women who did pass tests to become an astronaut in between 1960 and 61 in America. But never made it into space. But Wally's unusual in that, unlike the other women, she is actually in with a chance of getting there because she's bought a ticket on Virgin Galactic.
Oh, wow.
Spaceship One.
Will that ever fly, though, Sue?
Could get into space in the new arena of commercial spaceflight.
That's a wonderful story. But will Virgin space travel ever happen? They've been bedeviled by lots of
I'm in no
troubles.
doubt. It's absolutely that they've already had 2 successful powered flights earlier this year. They're talking about months now. For ages, it has always been Richard Branson. You know, he talks a good talk. He always says, "Oh yes, we'll be sending them next year. And he's been saying we'll be sending them next year into space for a good 15 years now or something like that.
Yes.
But actually they are very, very close, and it's wonderful. And in fact, I met when it does go up, the spaceship, it's called Spaceship One, it seats 6 passengers, 2 pilots, and I've actually gone to where it will take off from, which is Spaceport America, which is this beautiful...
And we hope land back on.
Oh, yes, beautiful, like 2-mile-long runway in New Mexico. And that's where they are hoping to go up into space, carried on board another ship to get to a certain height before the spaceship is released to go not into orbit. It won't go into orbit, but it will go into space, which is called suborbital, and then the passengers will have about, 3 to 6 minutes weightless, and actually in space we'll be able to see the Earth, the stars in one direction, the curvature of the Earth in the other, before it comes back down. And
that's a pretty hot ticket. What does it cost?
Well, now, if you wanted to buy one today, it would cost you $250,000. Okay. When the tickets were first out, they were around $200,000 when they were bought. And Wally bought hers for $200,000 in 2010, and I met quite a few of the passengers who have bought tickets. And as you might imagine, some of them are incredibly wealthy. Some of them were actually people who were using their life savings. So they weren't particularly rich. It was just something they had spent.
You could probably crowdfund sending certain people into space. Maybe I'm one of them. You could probably get probably get a lot of people
who
who
get there, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Now, I mentioned earlier that it is a bit of a puzzle to me why we haven't gone back to the moon. Now, another mogul, Elon Musk, he's planning that, isn't he? Tell us about it.
Yes, he is, and to be fair, he may be getting all the headlines now, but he's not the only one. There has been a sort of rumbling and a mumble. The European Space Agency announced that they wanted to go back to the moon and were putting a focus on that quite a few years ago, and in fact to the point where in Cologne, they are actually building a sort of an analogue of the lunar surface. So a building where you can go in and it will have soil that is exactly like, or not soil, but because it's more like ground up volcanic rock than anything else, lunar dust. So to feel exactly the same, to simulate being on the moon. They're actually working on building materials and 3D printing to actually build a lunar base. And NASA now are back. They want to get back to the moon. For a number of years, they were talking about Mars. But anybody privately, if you spoke to anybody at NASA, they would say, well, there's no way we can get there anytime soon. So Elon Musk, in a way, is riding the coattails of an already popular movement to get back to the moon. And what he's aiming to do is not to land somebody on the moon, but to effectively take them on the most amazing sort of trip of a lifetime.
Wow, what a charabang that would be, huh?
Yeah, a week's
What a works outing that would be. Let's go around the moon.
I would love to do that. I would absolutely love to do that. I mean, I could think of nothing more amazing and awe-inspiring and incredible to be able to see the moon and the Earth from that position. And not surprisingly, the person who's bought the ticket, he did announce this last year, but he didn't say who it was. And now he said, and not surprisingly, it's a billionaire. It's a Japanese billionaire who wants to take some artists with him.
Well, what do you get the man who's got everything for his birthday? You get him a trip round the moon, don't you?
Absolutely, and it doesn't come without risk, of course, because like any form of space endeavour, I mean, we're so used to now of seeing launches not just from the space agencies of NASA or east of the European Space Agency. You've got India, you've got Japan, you've got all countries, you've got China, you've got all these countries who are spacefaring nations now, but the most risky bit is always the launch. It's always the launch, but that is obviously what people are prepared to take because the rewards are so high, and it's an amazing technological achievement, of course.
So the pace is picking up. I mean, when I was young, space was really something. It was vogue. Gagarin, the Sputnik went up first, the very first satellite orbiting the world. Then Gagarin was the first man in space. Valentina was the first woman in space. Then there were the American moon landings. So between, in that decade or a little more than a decade, there was a public thrill involved in all of this. And then we seem to enter quite a fallow period.
Absolutely.
But from what you describe, it's picking up pace again.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because towards the end of the Apollo missions, although there was that excitement of people, I mean, millions and millions of people worldwide were watching the sort of moon landings and the first few landing missions, and then towards the end of it, hardly anybody was that interested. I mean, public interest dropped quite quickly, and it was really the space shuttle missions that brought more access to space, because you could suddenly take up much more people at once. You could take many more astronauts at once. Yeah. And with the demise of the space shuttle and that sort of hiatus of waiting for a sort of intermediary vehicle to take from the US side up there, that's when you've also had the rise of all these commercial space flight companies like SpaceX with Elon Musk, like Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos, and then you've got smaller companies as well, like Moon Express, who are based right by SpaceX at Cape Canaveral, and I've been there. They want to put lunar landers on the moon in order to effectively prospect. It's like the moon has become the new Wild West. They want to do mining because there are resources on the moon that people think, well, why trash the Earth even further when you can get some of these very rare but important materials that are often used in our electronic devices from the moon instead. So there's a reason why so many people want to go back. It's not just space tourism; it's business.
A good time to be
as well.
good time to be a space journalist, I think so.
Oh, do you know what?
You must love your job.
I do. I absolutely love it because it never stands still. It changes. It's always surprising, and it's not just the crude human spaceflight missions that are interesting, because obviously they've got the personality factor. But when you get, like recently, there was that wonderful Rosetta mission to a comet where they landed a spacecraft on a comet for the first time, and we've got a mission in just a few weeks that will go to Mercury, the Bepi Colombo mission, which has got a lot of UK scientists working on it. In fact, one of the instruments on board was all put together by scientists in Leicester, at the University of Leicester. You know, this is, we're exploring. It's amazing to think for such a small planet in a small part of a spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, which is one of hundreds of billions in the universe, that we're actually spreading our footprint, our human footprint, across our galaxy.
The final frontier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Live long and prosper.
Sue Nelson, space journalist and author of Wally Funk's Race for Space. Leo is in Belfast. He's from the People's Vote campaign, and I'm glad he's on the line. Leo, welcome.
Hello, George.
Now, a majority of people in the north of Ireland voted to remain in the EU. How are they reacting to the very severe difficulties in which the whole Brexit project is now in?
A significant amount of anger and disdain, and also a little hint of apathy as well.
Apathy?
Yeah, just a little. I mean, it's such a horrible thing that so many people just think, I don't even want to think about it. You know, we're in that stage of depression, really, as a nation right now.
No, it must cross communities for it to have been a majority vote. I'm assuming that the great majority of the nationalist population voted to remain because their main political organisations were campaigning for that. But there must have been a significant number of people in the unionist community who voted to remain, even though their political organisations were campaigning for Brexit. How did that work?
Yes, well, I mean, the DUP were campaigning for Brexit, for leaving the EU, but I do believe that in the unionist community specifically, it was much more of a 50-50 decision. I'm not sure if there's any statistics published on how that community voted, but I'd say it's a very even spread.
Now, to what extent are people drawing the conclusion, which seems to me supremely logical, that the best way to remain in the EU is to rejoin Ireland?
I certainly think that some people take that opinion. It's something that I've partially considered myself. I would definitely wish to remain in the UK, without a doubt, but to see a greater divide between North and South it's quite frankly, it's barely worth contemplating. And I can't see, I mean, in the economic sense, like, our main competitor is the Republic of Ireland, that is Northern Ireland. I mean, I can't see any reason why there would be any significant amount of growth here if we were to leave the EU.
Well, then the North has benefited a lot from EU funding, hasn't it? And that would all go.
Yeah, absolutely. A significant amount of, I mean, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of community projects, we've gained massively from our membership. It's really eased, I think, the transition between the violence of the past and the peace that we find ourselves in the present. Absolutely, it'll be a problem.
So you might get the situation where people who loved being a part of the United Kingdom would, in other circumstances, if Britain had not voted to leave the EU, would have been happier to remain in it. But if faced with the choice, if you were a Northern Ireland Unionist voting farmer, for example, you might well say, well, I like the UK, but I like the EU more.
I can't say about that specific demographic, but I think for anyone who has an economic interest in Northern Ireland and in the Northern Irish future, it certainly impacts their decision on whether they wish to remain in the UK.
Leo, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for calling. Let's go to John in Glasgow. John, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George. The misguided, flawed ideology that just because the majority in the north of Ireland voted to stay in the European Union, they voted to stay in the European Union as the United Kingdom. It's entirely wrong to then draw the conclusion, as they have tried to do in Scotland, that means that they will want to stay in the European Union as part of a united Ireland, George.
Well, the polls indicate differently.
Well, there was a nationalist, and I was heartened to hear a nationalist who actually had the courage to call in earlier to point out that although he is a fervent supporter of a united Ireland, the financial aspects of the mess that the Southern Irish state has got itself into means that they don't want to know about it. And I personally think that other than perhaps very hard-line nationalists who will blindly ignore all that, people will look at the economics of it, which is the huge amount of debt in the state of Southern Ireland, unless the few...
We've got a fair bit of debt ourselves, John.
Sorry?
We've got a fair bit of debt ourselves.
Well, the Southern Irish debt, they have got Leo Varadkar there, who, to be honest, as a former European Union apparatchik or MEP, is nothing more than, frankly, a Lord Protector of Ireland now for the European Union. They don't really want to know. And until the Southern Irish state rids itself of that type of political...
I think we call it the Republic of Ireland, John. It's a bit politically incorrect to call it the Southern Irish state.
Well, okay, Republic
You're a Rangers
of
man,
Ireland.
John.
Republic of Ireland or whatever, but it is effectively a Southern Irish state. It's a bit like the argument about whether it should be Northern Ireland. But I personally think, George, it's the same as what they tried to do in Scotland here. Just because the majority of people in Scotland voted to stay in the European Union, they voted to stay in the European Union as part of the United Kingdom. To then draw the conclusion, as the SNP did here, that then meant that there was going to be support for separatism of Scotland is entirely wrong.
Well, there is quite a lot of support for separatism in Scotland, unfortunately, and there may well be, if Britain finally leaves the European Union, there might well be another referendum in Scotland. Are you sanguine about that? Are you confident of what the outcome of that would be?
I believe so. I mean, the whole situation here about the no deal as well. I mean, if you look at any map, we'll take a world atlas out. Where does a no deal leave the Republic of Ireland in all of this? They would remain not even a semi-detached part of the European Union, but a completely detached part of the European Union. And if the Republic of Ireland government were doing their job properly, they should be the most fervent supporters of smoothing the way to a deal to enable the United Kingdom to leave on a proper basis, because they are the very state that will find themselves completely detached from the rest of mainland Europe and the rest of the European Union. So if there is no deal and there's customs, borders and all the rest of it, where is that going to leave them, George?
Well, perhaps it's a bluff by the European Union, but it didn't look that way at Salzburg, did it? The grim, hard-faced men of the EU bureaucracy, as I said earlier, they looked like the board of SMERSH,
well, that's right.
having their annual general meeting. Not many soft hearts there, I don't think.
Absolutely not. But I have every sympathy for the people in the Republic of Ireland. But the idea that the people in the north are going to take on their share of the debt, I think is teary-eyed, misty-eyed nationalism on one side, but the harsh reality of it is who wants to be a part of that, George? And that gentleman who called up earlier, who stated he was a nationalist and pointed out all the stuff to do with the health care and what they're costing. And
no,
what
it was me that raised the healthcare, but the most extant opinion poll showed only 34% of people in the north would want to remain in the UK if it meant leaving the EU. Just 34%, 56% preferring to leave the UK and join the Republic if that meant remaining in the EU.
Well, there's nothing wrong with them having a poll up there if that's what the people want to do.
I feel sure that that's coming down the pipe. John, thanks very much for the call. Now, Charlotte Ndupwechi, if I've pronounced that properly, let me spell it. Charlotte, and then the second name, Ndupeuechi, sends this beautiful, beautiful message. It's my parents' 55th wedding anniversary today, and instead of going out, they want to stay home to listen to you. Please say hi to Mr. and Mrs. Jess, long-time fans. Well, hi wouldn't be nearly enough to say. I'm taking my metaphorical hat off to you. I'm wishing you a very happy 55th wedding anniversary and many, many more to come. The very best to you, and I'm really deeply touched by that. And thank you, Charlotte, for sending that in. Neil in Glasgow says, do you think a no-deal Brexit will lead to another Scottish independence referendum? And if so, what would the result be? Let's say if the Conservatives won another election. Well, there's a lot of ifs and buts there, Neil. If the Conservatives won another election, even I might be on the side of Scottish independence. But that's not by any means a foregone conclusion. My position is clear. It's a matter of principle. The Scottish people have a right to self-determination. They did exercise that right in the referendum in 2014, and they voted quite decisively, really, 55 to 45, against leaving Britain. And I campaigned for that outcome and indeed predicted it to the very percentage point. They're entitled, therefore, to have another go any time they like. I still believe that the Scottish people would vote to remain in the United Kingdom. I still believe that. I would still prefer that. But everything will be up for grabs if there is another referendum. Now, my good friend Mike Graham, just before he goes on the air with the other
Mr.
Mike,
Galloway,
in talkSPORT, just next door, the two mics I listen to every Friday night. It is, in my opinion, the best radio show anywhere in the world.
You've been very kind and said that in the past, and even made it public on Twitter, which is a tremendous thing to do. But
I really mean it, so much so I've even signed up for your two mics.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Very good. Well, that's all going
two
swimmingly
mics,
well.
TV.
And
that's
you
good.
know, the
what have you got tonight?
Well,
Tell
tonight
us.
we've got a great deal of things going on. We're looking ahead, of course, to all the football action and the boxing Anthony Joshua is getting involved in on Saturday night. I noticed that a lot of people are now saying, well, of course, Anthony Joshua might lose this fight, which is a very clever way of promoting it, of course. Because
he might lose it in the first few rounds.
Well,
if he
might.
gets past the first few rounds, he'll be
he
all
might,
right.
but he's quite an incredible boxing machine and a physical specimen. I mean, the guy is
He's
literally...
no Muhammad Ali, though. The idea that he can recreate the rumble in the jungle,
I know.
it's a bit insulting.
But, the trouble is you and I are both old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is nobody now in the world of boxing that would be anything like... I mean, I once did an interview. You might remember a guy called Leon Spinks.
Yeah, very well.
I went to find him.
He beat Ali.
He did beat Ali, but he tells a magnificent story. I went to do his story because we were doing a piece about the kind of the disappointment of once having greatness and then losing it, something that many of your political colleagues, I'm sure, will have embraced over the years. And do you know where I found him? I found him in a bar outside the Ford Motor Company plant in Detroit, where he sat there and entertained people who came in wanting to hear about his past, right? And he wore a fur coat, which he had got from when he was heavyweight champion of the world. It was the only thing he had left. He had no front teeth. He was drinking a mixture of Cointreau and lager, which was like sort of firewater. I spent many an hour with him. We ended up going for dinner. He was a lovely man, beautiful man. But he told this incredible story of how he went to the second fight where Ali beat him, which I think was in New Orleans, with Don King and a coterie of beautiful women. And he said as he was fighting Ali, and he could see that the fight was not going well, basically Don King was moving further and further away from his corner and closer to Ali's corner. And by the end of the fight, Don King was in Ali's corner and thrusting the belt above his head as if he was his manager. And of course, he lost everything. And he said, I went to the fight in a limousine. I walked back to the hotel.
Let's hope none of that ever happens to us. That we are sitting in a fur coat outside a motor plant.
Well, I can tell you that may well happen. We are talking to an author as well off the sporting front, a guy called Christopher Howes, who's written a book called Soho in the 80s, and it's all about that kind of Geoffrey Barnard period, the French House.
Yeah.
You know, all of those places.
I worked at Private Eye at that time.
Okay, so you'll know.
I know the Soho.
So you'll know all of the hangouts before the Groucho Club ever came
I'm
into
looking
existence.
forward to.
So that should be very interesting indeed. Porky, of course, can't remember anything from the 80s because I'm afraid he's had too much to drink.
That means he was there. Yeah.
But listen, I must pick you up on a couple of things because I've been listening to the show on the way in.
Yeah.
And I just thought I'd throw my tuppence halfpenny worth in about the Irish.
Of course, yeah.
debate.
I know you're furious about it.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because I listened to what you said, and of course your arguments are always very well put together and very eloquently described. However, I wonder whether if the 300,000 unionists of who you speak, who should not be holding up the whole kind of debate here about whether Britain leaves the European Union or not, or how it leaves the European Union, if they were some minority or other who were not unionists, you wouldn't just ride roughshod over them. You wouldn't just say, well, they can just, sit there and be told what to do. If they should have a say in whether or not Ireland becomes a unified country again. Surely you can't just say to them,
of course.
we're just going to throw you to the wolves and you'll just have to put up with it.
That's in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
It's a border poll. None of this can happen without consent.
Yes.
The question is this ineluctable march towards consent. Yes. By 2026, there'll be a Roman Catholic majority in the 6 counties.
Yes.
But even long before that, and that is only 8 years away, you've got this conundrum that the majority, 50% of the unionists voted to remain in the EU.
Yeah.
And almost all of the nationalists voted to remain in the EU. That's why we got the result that we did. So a border poll might come long before 2026.
No, indeed, but don't you realise as well that with the consent that we try to now give everybody, it's not possible to make it work. You can't give consent to everyone. You can ask them what they want to do, but there's still going to be a very large majority, probably, of them who don't get what they want. Because in the end, these referenda are kind of, being very divisive in Scotland.
Well, we're learning that now. We're learning that about Brexit and in Scotland.
Well, we are, and I see no reason why until the Irish people actually demand a referendum on their own, sovereignty, which I don't think they'll ever want in total. That you can't really give it because it will mean that people in the unionist side will have to move back to Britain, won't they? Because they will want to be British citizens.
Yeah, well, I used to say about the Falklands, if they loved Britain that much, we could make them all millionaires and bring them back here and save quite a bit of money.
Anybody who wanted to voluntarily go to the Falklands should have been immediately castigated as insane, because there's nothing there.
No, but if you think about it, we were spending, I don't know how many billions now we've spent on defending the Falklands for 2,300 people.
Yeah.
We could have made them all as rich as Croesus. Yes. And brought them here.
Indeed, when we could have put them in Belfast, maybe. But I mean, the other thing is, of course, the people of Northern Ireland are very opinionated. They are, of course, split down all sorts of lines, whether it be Catholic and Protestant, or whether they support Dublin or whether they support Stormont.
Or Celtic and Rangers.
Celtic and Rangers. I'll never forget driving through Belfast and coming upon the Rangers Supporters Club. I've never seen anything like it in my entire life, where the streets are actually painted with the Union Jack. I mean, it's incredible. But, these are people who are incredibly sort of strong-willed. They've managed to run themselves now without any kind of political government, for some months very, very well. I mean, I say we just leave them as they are, forget the politicians. The idea that the Labour Party should have some kind of, a call on what they want to do. I mean, Labour doesn't have any representation there. There's no Labour MPs there.
Consent is absolutely guaranteed, and it would have to be a poll, and there would have to be a majority in the north of Ireland to vote to rejoin the Republic.
But look at this majority that we're currently facing, 52-48. We've got the 48 saying it's not enough.
Yeah, you're right. It wouldn't be the end of the argument.
No.
That's for sure. We know that on these 2 referenda we're talking about.
Yeah.
But from our point of view, and we're not Irish, we're British.
Yes.
Are we really going to go over the cliff of a no-deal Brexit just because of our determination to defend a border which is supported by so few people?
Well, I don't think it's about that. I think it's about a principle of not going over a cliff as much as it is about just leaving. I said this morning on my show on Talk Radio, after the way Theresa May was treated yesterday, and I've never, ever felt sorry for Theresa May in my life, but I did this morning.
She was treated abominably.
She was treated abominably.
Britain was treated abominably.
Yes, it was. And funnily enough, I said it's a bit like when somebody has a go at you in your family, that's fine. But if somebody else has a go at your family, which is what it felt like, then you defend them, even if you don't like them very much. And I think it's not about all these doom mongers like Mr. Matt Kelley, former colleague of mine from the Daily Mirror, who's seemingly gone mad and spends half his life hanging around with Alistair Campbell. You know, and they believe.
Well, you would if you hung around with Alistair Campbell, you'd be mad.
Well, he does have form, I think you would say. But the point is that you cannot just go around telling everyone. I mean, he's obsessed with the idea that everybody's changed their mind. Everybody hasn't changed their mind.
On the contrary,
there is absolutely no evidence for that.
I think you'd get a bigger majority to leave.
After what happened yesterday.
After what happened yesterday, if you called the vote next Thursday, you'd get a bigger majority to leave the EU than you would have last Thursday.
Yeah, and I said, if I was Theresa May, I would say to them, you know what, I'm not talking to you anymore. If they want to be childish, we can be childish. And she more or less did that this afternoon. So I'm quite glad that she did that. It's not about Ireland. I think there are some who would make it about Ireland. There are some, like Matt, who would make it about anything as long as they could somehow persuade people to have a second vote, which would be a disaster.
A second vote would, first of all, if it went against Brexit, would leave millions of people, perhaps many millions of people, so embittered by the betrayal that involved that you actually couldn't predict what some of them would do.
That's right.
And if it reaffirmed that we were Brexiting,
then
what then?
What's Lord Adonis going to say then?
Exactly.
Maybe you go back to his infrastructure committee and mess up the railways for a few more of us.
Well, referenda don't solve things, but there are some things that only referenda can decide.
Yeah.
You can't leave a decision as big as being in or out of the EU to Parliament, and we didn't do that when we joined in '75. We had a referendum on whether we should be in the EU or EC as it was then, EEC. And we've now had a referendum that said that we're leaving with a majority of well over 1 million people. So, I always say to callers that when they say, should we leave, that decision's already been made. The only thing that's up for grabs now is what terms on which we
And it's only
leave.
the kind of cognoscenti who you were describing earlier with their chiffon scarves. And their lattes.
I thought that dated me a little. I'm not even sure a chiffon scarf is a thing now.
Well, I'd heard of it. So
yeah, but then we're done certain out, as we will no longer say in Brexit Britain.
That may not help you out. But certainly the latte brigade, as everybody would know them to be, they're the ones that are keeping this going. They're the ones that are actually now responsible for drumming up, kind of hatred and all sorts of horrible feelings between people in this country by saying it's all going to be terrible, it's all going to be a nightmare, and the people who should be defending Brexit are not doing a very good job of saying, well, don't you remember how useless and awful the EU was? It wasn't any good, and it's run its course.
Well, I saw the last Macchiato Brigade march. I didn't hear it because they were all in soft suede shoes. But I did smell it first before it arrived, the whiff of macchiato and expensive cologne. I then saw the waving of the chiffon scarves. And I saw them very politely marching past because everything they do is polite. But they have effectively been a fifth column of the Smersh board
I couldn't agree
that
more.
were sitting over in Salzburg.
Yeah.
But here's a last point, if I may.
Yes.
How many times, you must feel this, how many times do you get opinion makers, opinion formers, experts on your show who come out with stuff that turns out to be so dramatically wrong? Like Peter Oborn last Friday, and he's a friend of mine and I admire him.
Yes, me too.
Last Friday, he said the hills will be alive in Salzburg with the sound of music.
Yes.
And Merkel and May will kiss and the deal will be done. How do you keep your job when your predictions keep...
Isn't that incredible?
Well, I mean, the one
thing he did get right was at least it all happened in the same place where apparently the Nazis chased the Von Trapps across the stage.
The very same place.
You couldn't make that up. I mean, It's almost like we are already in pantomime terms.
Well, to paraphrase Groucho Marx, any club that would treat us in the way they treated us yesterday or the day before, I wouldn't want to be a member. But then I never wanted to be a member.
Abiento, I think, is the words you were looking for.
Abiento.
I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Mike. I'll look forward to listening to the two Mikes tonight. Of course, other shows are available, including here on Talk Radio, where the great and surreally brilliant Ian Lee will be up after me. Mal says, George, as a UK unionist in Northern Ireland, if you gave me a vote on a united Ireland outside of European control that went on and formed a trading bloc with the rest of the UK, I'd take it. Not a bad scheme, that, Mal. And Marie McFarlane, my friend, says, I could have listened to Sue Nelson, space journalist, all night. So interesting. Can we have her on every week? Well, I don't know about every week, but she was very interesting indeed. And you'll like, Marie, my television show tomorrow on the same kind of subject, but going farther afield than the moon. Mal says, George, flippancy on unionists getting out of Ireland is like telling 150 million Irish Americans to get out of the USA and give it back to the Native Americans. I'm not sure about that, Mal. And Tony says, Gigi, I realised as soon as Guy Verhofstadt visited Belfast that the EU would use the border against us. Let's hear from Chris in Colchester. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George.
Hi, mate.
Yeah, just a few points. Well, actually, I think Tyson Fury's got a bit of Muhammad Ali in him, especially outside the ring. But regarding Corbyn, I think
only outside the ring. But you're right, he's a great character.
Yeah. Regarding Corbyn, I just feel he's been spineless these last few months and shown a lack of leadership. And if I was in his position, I think he's had the opportunity to really explain to people why he's been against the EU for all these years, and he's kind of not really done that. And
you obviously don't know the people sitting around him, Chris.
Well, I do. I understand that, but I think he could actually get the voters on his side, and then those people don't become so powerful.
Fair point.
But Yanis Varoufakis and Peter Hitchens should go for the Norway option because it would sort of deal with the Irish border. And Yanis kind of says, because we're so entwined in the EU, we could take the Norway option and then maybe sort of transition away from that further outside the EU. I just wondered if you thought that could be a point, and maybe that's something Corbyn could kind of push for. I don't know.
No, the Norway option is worse than remaining where we are as we are. The Norway option would mean that we had no say on what the EU rules and laws should be, but we'd have to obey them. And we'd still have to accept what they call free movement, what I call the free movement of cheap labour. And that it's the free movement of cheap labour which tipped the balance in the British referendum. The working class people, the farther away from London that you get, are not prepared to accept a continuation of the free movement of cheap labour, which presses down on wages, presses up on rents, and presses up on pressure on public services. But if you take the Norway option, you've got to accept that.
How come Peter Hitchens, he's against mass immigration? I don't understand why he's saying we should go for the Norway option.
Are you sure you're talking about Peter Hitchens?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, honestly.
I must look that up. That up. No, Norway's status in the EU is that it must accept free movement of labour.
Yeah, well,
and I'm not prepared to accept that. But more importantly, the huge numbers, millions and millions of them, elsewhere outside of this bubble that I live and work in, are definitely not to, because they are the workers that are competing for labour and wages and rents and public services. I'm fine. From my point of view, membership of the EU, for me personally, my family personally, is lovely. We flit around borderless, without let or hindrance. We get the best macchiato in the world served by the loveliest waiters from Slovenia, Slovakia, or wherever. It's all great. But if you're in Lincolnshire or in the northeast or the northwest or the southwest or South Wales That doesn't feel that way.
No, I don't, and I agree with that, and I'm kind of the same as well. But I think the trouble is, I don't think that, we're told that people who voted Brexit don't understand about the EU or what we voted for, but I think it's actually the Remainers that...
Well said, Chris.
Don't understand.
Well said. I mentioned Lincolnshire. Let me go to Alice. Thanks, Chris, for that call. Alice, you're the last caller, probably. Go ahead.
Hello there. It's an honour to speak to you, sir. I'm just calling about the lady who called earlier, and it's actually interesting that gentleman just mentioned about understanding EU institutions. The lady who called earlier, the paralegal, she raised, rightly, concerns about the Human Rights Act and the loss of many important protections for citizens in the UK. I would just add to that and clarify something, because I think it's an important point. The Human Rights Act is an act of Parliament that's passed because we signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. That's governed and is under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. That's a very different court and a very different jurisdiction to the European Court of Justice. In 1973, Edward Heath said, there'll be no loss of sovereignty, we are joining the European Union, it's all going to be wonderful. And 5 years later, Lord Denning said, actually, there is a loss of sovereignty, and the law that's coming in is like a tide of legislation. And so we realised that we entered on a referendum based on inaccuracy.
Yep.
We're leaving, in a sense, on inaccuracy because of the claims that have been made at 350 million. However, I think the important point is that once post-Brexit will mean that we will no longer have the jurisdiction of the European Court. It deals, and it's different to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Justice deals with those things that we hear about: the free movement of goods, free movement of workers, unfair market practices, environmental laws, monopolies, and there's a lot of really good legislation that has come from Europe. But I would echo the lady, the paralegal. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten her name, because she is right. Europe has not done enough to protect the rights of citizens in this country.
Never mind in this country, Alice. What about the rights of the workers in Greece? What did it do for them? It killed them.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and it's because, ironically, the Europe gives autonomy to the states themselves, because there has to be a degree of autonomy, but there also has to be a degree of equivalence and equity and equality. That isn't happening because our Conservative government, and the reason that the human rights is under threat is not because we're leaving, not because of Brexit, but that would be a separate choice made by our government, and they've been showing their intention to do that over the last few years because they have been withdrawing legal aid, or what was legal aid is now legal funding. I mean, it's not just cut to the bone; it has effectively been eradicated.
Yes, if you get the government you vote for, Alice, we're perfectly capable as a people of electing a better government than the one we've got now.
Absolutely, and I think that it's disingenuous for the media to say that Europe is in control of these things. They're not. Our government has voted in all of the cuts, and it smacks of a phrase, disarming the citizens. If you disarm the citizens of their rights to access justice, which is a fundamental human right, then they no longer have the education, they can't access the rights that they should have because they're not going to be enforced. And so I don't remember the EU official, quite a senior official, who said Europe had, in a sense, failed the citizens of the UK, and they know it. And they don't really want to lose this, but they don't want what May is offering. They don't. I wonder if Corbyn's going to be better. I mean, I am a Corbyn supporter. I do believe in his version of Labour. I don't believe in the Blairite version, and I think it's probably going to be the best option. But I really think it's important for people to understand that Brexit is not what the media is portraying it to be, and the confusion kind of needs to be addressed. It's only through education that people can make informed choices. And
that's undoubtedly true, and this has been a fantastic call, Alice, and especially as it's the last one. Let me put it to you this way. Brexit is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the kind of Britain you and I want to live in. It's not sufficient. Only a fool would pretend it was. But it is necessary, because without Brexit, there is no possibility of that better Britain. That's why I supported Brexit. What about you?
Well, I confess I was a Remainer, and I'm now, I never thought the day would happen, but I am now questioning, because I think I do not want a Brexit with a Conservative government. I know that the several years that I've witnessed where they have just withdrawn so many rights to people that are very, very important. You must be able to challenge the state. If you privatise, you can't challenge the state. You get rid of pension rights. All of the things that people are complaining about is down to privatisation, and we need to toe that back. And the Conservatives aren't going to do it. Liberal Democrats who propped up the government, the Conservative government, aren't going to do it because they can be bought. And I think the only government that we're going to have that will make those changes that we really, really need is going to be a Corbyn government.
Alice, you are a credit to the Open University of the Airwaves. A fantastic and final call. Asif says, if everybody could disagree in the way you and Mike Graham do, the world would be a much better place. Fantastic debate. Fantastic show. And Tony X says, George and Mike, it's okay to call them the bourgeoisie. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time, same place.